The forests of British Columbia, Canada, are home to some of North America's most magnificent wildlife, including black bears and grizzly bears that roam the vast wilderness. These powerful predators are generally feared and avoided by humans, and for good reason. Bears are wild animals with unpredictable behaviors and the strength to cause serious harm. But on April 12, 2023, in the small mountain community of Bella Coola, a story unfolded that would challenge everything wildlife experts thought they knew about human-bear relationships and ultimately spark a national debate about wildlife rehabilitation, conservation ethics, and the complex bonds that can form between humans and wild animals. Susan Thornhill, a 58-year-old wildlife photographer and former veterinary technician, had lived alone in her remote property for over 20 years. Her home, situated on 40 acres of forested land bordering the Bella Coola Valley, was isolated. The nearest neighbor was 3 kilometers away, and the small town center was a 20-minute drive on rough logging roads. Susan had chosen this solitude deliberately, seeking a life close to nature where she could pursue her passion for wildlife photography without the constraints of urban living. "I moved here to be near the animals, to document their lives, to understand them," Susan explained months later during a widely viewed interview. "I never intended to become involved the way I did. But sometimes life presents you with situations where you must choose between following regulations and following your conscience." That situation arrived on a cold April morning when Susan heard desperate crying coming from the forest edge near her property. Following the sound, she discovered a black bear cub, estimated at only 6 to 8 weeks old, crying pitifully beside the body of its dead mother. The adult female bear had been killed, likely by a vehicle strike on the nearby highway, and had managed to crawl into the forest before dying. The tiny cub, still dependent on its mother for everything, was cold, starving, and completely helpless. "The moment I saw that cub, I knew I faced an impossible choice," Susan recalled, her voice tight with emotion. "By law, I should have immediately contacted wildlife authorities. They would have evaluated the cub and most likely euthanized it. Orphaned cubs that young rarely survive rehabilitation and release. But looking into that baby's eyes, hearing its desperate cries, I couldn't make that call. I couldn't sentence it to death when I had the knowledge and resources to possibly save it." Susan had worked for 15 years as a veterinary technician before retiring to pursue photography. She had extensive experience with animal care, including wildlife rehabilitation, though never with bears. She understood the risks, both legal and physical. Raising a bear cub was illegal without proper permits. It was also dangerous. Even young bears possess remarkable strength and sharp claws. And perhaps most importantly, it raised serious questions about whether a human-raised bear could ever successfully return to the wild. Check if you're already subscribed to this channel, because these incredible true stories reveal the complex ethical dilemmas at the intersection of wildlife conservation, human compassion, and the law. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss these thought-provoking real-life stories that challenge our assumptions about the natural world. But in that moment, faced with a dying cub, Susan made her decision. She carefully picked up the small bear. It weighed perhaps 4 kilograms, wrapped it in her jacket, and carried it back to her cabin. Over the next 72 hours, she worked frantically to keep the cub alive, feeding it a specialized formula she prepared based on her veterinary knowledge, keeping it warm, and monitoring its health constantly. "Those first 3 days I didn't sleep more than 2 hours at a time," Susan explained. "The cub, I named her Bella, after the valley, was so weak. She had been without food for at least 24 hours before I found her, possibly longer. She was dehydrated, hypothermic, and traumatized. I wasn't sure she would survive. But Bella did survive. Within a week, she was gaining weight, becoming more active, and beginning to show the playful curiosity characteristic of healthy bear cubs." Susan had converted a large storage shed on her property into a temporary enclosure, providing Bella with shelter while allowing outdoor access to a fenced area where the cub could experience natural elements. As weeks turned into months, Susan documented everything meticulously. She took photographs, kept detailed journals of Bella's development, recorded feeding schedules, behavioral observations, and health assessments. She also did extensive research on bear biology, wild bear behavior, and rehabilitation protocols used by licensed facilities. "I knew this situation was temporary," Susan insisted. "I never intended to keep Bella permanently. My goal from the beginning was to prepare her for eventual release back into the wild. But I also knew that releasing a bear that had bonded with humans was extremely problematic. I was caught between impossible options. As Bella grew, and bear cubs grow remarkably fast, the situation became increasingly complex. By 3 months, Bella weighed 20 kilograms. By 6 months, she was 45 kilograms and strong enough to accidentally hurt Susan during play. The cub had bonded intensely with Susan, following her everywhere, sleeping near her, and showing clear distress when separated. The bond was undeniable, Susan admitted. Bella saw me as her mother. I had imprinted on her in ways that concerned me deeply. This wasn't a pet relationship. Bella was always a wild animal with wild instincts. But she had also learned to associate humans, specifically me, with safety and food. That association could get her killed in the wild. Susan began implementing what she called wild training, techniques designed to encourage natural bear behaviors while discouraging dependence on humans. She placed food in ways that required Bella to forage rather than being fed directly. She reduced physical contact. She played recordings of wild bears and encouraged Bella to spend increasing time away from the cabin. I was trying to dehabituate a bear I had habituated, Susan explained, acknowledging the contradiction. It was an extremely difficult process, emotionally and practically, but I believed it was Bella's only chance at a wildlife. By Bella's first birthday, the situation had reached a critical point. The bear now weighed approximately 80 kilograms and was approaching the age where wild bears become independent from their mothers. Susan knew she needed professional guidance, but reaching out meant admitting to a year of illegal wildlife possession and facing potential prosecution. That decision was taken out of her hands on September 15, 2023, when Forest Ranger James McKenzie received an anonymous tip about a woman living with a bear in the Bella Coola area. James, a 20-year veteran of wildlife management, had dealt with countless human-wildlife conflict situations, but never anything quite like this. When I received that call, I expected to find someone who had mistakenly been feeding bears and created a nuisance situation, James recalled. What I found was completely different and far more complicated. James arrived at Susan's property with a conservation officer and veterinarian in tow, prepared for what they assumed would be a straightforward situation. Confiscate the bear, educate the homeowner, possibly issue citations, and transport the bear to a facility or euthanize it if rehabilitation wasn't feasible. What they found stopped them in their tracks. In a large naturalistic enclosure visible from Susan's cabin, a young black bear was engaged in behaviors that demonstrated remarkable health and natural instinct. The bear was foraging, climbing, and showing no signs of the abnormal behaviors typical of captive bears. More surprisingly, when Susan approached, the bear didn't rush to her seeking food or attention. Instead, it acknowledged her presence but continued its natural activities. "I've seen hundreds of human-raised bears," James said during a later press conference. "They're almost always neurotic, food-obsessed, and demonstrating stereotypical behaviors that indicate poor welfare. Bella showed none of those signs. She was behaving like a wild bear, despite having been raised by a human." Susan met the officials with remarkable composure. She didn't make excuses or try to hide what she had done. Instead, she presented them with a comprehensive file, 12 months of detailed records, photographs, behavioral observations, health assessments, and her rehabilitation plan. "I know I broke the law," Susan told them directly. "I'm prepared to face whatever consequences that brings. But before you make any decisions about Bella's fate, I ask that you review this documentation and consult with bear behavior experts. What I've done may have been illegal, but I believe it was successful. Bella is healthy, exhibits natural behaviors, and with proper release protocols, I believe she can survive in the wild." James and his team were faced with an unprecedented dilemma. Legally, the situation was clear. Susan had violated wildlife laws, and the bear should be confiscated. But professionally and ethically, the situation was far more complex. Bella was undeniably healthy, well-adjusted, and showing more natural behavior than many bears raised in licensed facilities. We had to make a decision that balanced legal requirements, wildlife welfare, public safety, and conservation ethics, James explained. There was no precedent for this situation. We needed expert consultation. Over the following week, James coordinated with wildlife biologists, bear behavior specialists, and conservation organizations. Bella was thoroughly evaluated by veterinarians and behavioral experts. Susan's documentation was reviewed by professionals who were astonished by its detail and quality. Dr. Margaret Chen, a bear biologist from the University of British Columbia who was brought in to assess the situation, provided a detailed evaluation that would prove crucial. Bella exhibits natural foraging behaviors, appropriate wariness, and species-typical activity patterns. While she shows recognition of and tolerance for Susan specifically, she demonstrates appropriate caution toward other humans. Her physical health is excellent. Most significantly, she has not been food conditioned to seek out humans as sources of food, one of the primary factors that makes human-raised bears unsuitable for release. The evaluation concluded with a controversial recommendation. While this situation should never have occurred and should not be replicated, the bear's current condition suggests that a carefully managed release protocol might be viable. Euthanizing a healthy bear with release potential would be ethically questionable, regardless of the circumstances of her raising. This recommendation triggered intense debate among wildlife managers. Some argued that allowing Susan to avoid prosecution would set a dangerous precedent, potentially encouraging others to illegally raise wildlife. Others maintained that Bella's welfare should be the primary consideration, and that precedent was less important than making the right decision for this specific animal. The story had by this point reached national media. Public opinion was sharply divided. Some people saw Susan as a hero who had saved a helpless animal. Others viewed her as a lawbreaker who had created a potentially dangerous situation. Wildlife rehabilitation facilities were particularly critical, arguing that licensed facilities existed for exactly these situations and that bypassing proper channels undermined the entire system. What Susan did, regardless of her intentions, was illegal and potentially dangerous, stated Rachel Cartwright, director of a licensed bear rehabilitation center. We have laws and permitting systems for important reasons: to ensure wildlife welfare, public safety, and appropriate care standards. One person's good intentions don't justify ignoring those systems. But others, including some wildlife professionals, saw the situation differently. Susan did what many of us would struggle to do. She put aside her emotional attachment and focused on preparing this bear for wildlife, noted Dr. Thomas Anderson, a wildlife behaviorist. Her documentation shows sophisticated understanding of bear biology and behavior. The outcome, a healthy bear with release potential, suggests her approach, while unorthodox, was effective. After 2 weeks of evaluation, consultation, and deliberation, wildlife authorities made their decision. Susan would face charges for illegal wildlife possession, but would receive a conditional discharge with community service rather than prosecution. More importantly, Bella would not be euthanized. Instead, a carefully managed release protocol would be implemented, with Susan's cooperation, but under official supervision. This is not a precedent, James emphasized during the announcement. This is a unique situation with unique circumstances that led to a unique outcome. Anyone who illegally possesses wildlife should expect prosecution, not leniency. But in this specific case, the bear's welfare and release potential outweighed other considerations. The release protocol, developed by a team of bear experts, was methodical and careful. Bella was fitted with a GPS tracking collar. A remote release site was selected in an area with low human activity but suitable bear habitat and food resources. Susan was allowed to participate in the release, but under strict conditions. On October 28, 2023, Bella was transported to the release site. Susan was there, along with James, Dr. Chen, and several wildlife biologists. The moment of release was emotional and powerful. When I opened the transport crate, Bella looked at me one last time. Susan recounted, tears visible in her eyes. Then she walked out, sniffed the air, and moved into the forest without looking back. It was exactly what I had hoped for. She chose the wild over me. That's when I knew I had done right by her. Over the following months, Bella's movements were carefully monitored via her GPS collar. The data told a remarkable story. She successfully located food sources, established a home range, and showed no tendency to seek out human settlements or food sources. By spring 2024, she had denned successfully and emerged healthy. By all objective measures, Bella's release was successful, Dr. Chen reported. She is behaving like a wild bear, avoiding human contact, and successfully surviving. This doesn't justify what Susan did initially, but it does demonstrate that the outcome was positive. Susan completed her community service working with licensed wildlife rehabilitation facilities, sharing her documentation and observations to improve bear cub care protocols. She also became an advocate for preventing the situations that create orphaned cubs in the first place, particularly reducing vehicle bear collisions through better highway management in bear habitat. "I don't want anyone to see my story and think they should raise wildlife," Susan emphasized during educational presentations. "What I did was wrong legally, and it was dangerous, but it also revealed gaps in our wildlife management system, particularly in how we handle orphaned wildlife. If licensed facilities had been more accessible, if rehabilitation success rates were higher, if I had known that Bella had a real chance at a licensed facility, I would have made the call immediately." Her story sparked important conversations about wildlife rehabilitation infrastructure, particularly in remote areas. Several conservation organizations began examining whether more resources should be dedicated to orphaned wildlife rehabilitation, expanding capacity, and improving success rates. 1 year after Bella's release, she was still thriving in the wild. Her GPS collar had been designed to eventually fall off, and by that point she was living a fully wild existence, her human beginning a distant memory. "When I think about Bella now, living free in the forest, I feel both pride and regret," Susan reflected during a final interview. "Pride that she survived, that she's wild, that my efforts weren't in vain, but also regret that the situation ever happened, that I put myself in a position where breaking the law seemed like the only moral choice. The world isn't black and white. Sometimes we face situations where every option is wrong, and we have to choose the least wrong path and accept the consequences. If you watched until here, it's because you enjoyed this story. Leave a comment saying, 'I watched until here,' so I can get to know you and know who really enjoys the stories here on the channel. And if this complex story of compassion, ethics, and wildlife conservation made you think, hit the like button and share this video with anyone interested in the difficult decisions we face at the intersection of human compassion and wildlife law. Subscribe for more true stories that explore the complicated realities of conservation and our relationship with the natural world.